Ukrainian Canadians is a term that refers to Canadian citizens of Ukrainian descent, or Ukrainian-born people who emigrated to Canada. In 2011, there were an estimated 1,251,170 persons of full or partial Ukrainian origin residing in Canada, making them Canada's 9th largest ethnic group, and giving Canada the world's 3rd largest Ukrainian population behind Ukraine itself and Russia.Self-identified Ukrainians of the plurality in several rural areas of Western Canada. Of the 1,251,170 who identify as Ukrainian, only 144,260 can actually speak either the modern Ukrainian language or the archaic Canadian Ukrainian dialect. History. Over the last 35 years, a debate has been ongoing whether a tiny number of Ukrainians settled in Canada before 1891. Most controversial is the claim that Ukrainians may have been infantrymen alongside Poles in the Swiss-French de Meurons and de Watteville regiments who fought for the British on the Niagara Peninsula during the War of 1812, and that Ukrainians were among those soldiers who decided to stay in Upper Canada. Other Ukrainians supposedly arrived as part of other immigrant groups. It has been claimed that individual Ukrainian families may have settled in southern Manitoba in the 1870s alongside block settlements of Mennonites and other Germans from the Russian Empire. Galicians are noted as being among the miners of the British Columbia gold rushes and figure prominently in some towns in the new provinces. First census in 1871. Because there is so little definitive documentary evidence of individual Ukrainians among these three groups, they are not generally regarded as among the first Ukrainians in Canada. Settlement. First wave. During the 19th century, the territory inhabited by Ukrainians in Europe was divided between the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. The Austrian crownlands of Galicia and Bukovina were home to many Ukrainian speakers. Austrian Galicia was one of the poorest and most overpopulated regions in Europe, and had experienced a series of blights and famines. Emigration on a large scale from Galicia to the Balkans and even to Brazil was already underway by 1891. The first wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada began with the Pilipao and Wasyl Oleniak, who arrived in 1891, and brought several families to settle in 1892. Pilipao helped found the Edna Star settlement east of Edmonton, the first and largest Ukrainian bloc settlement. However, it is Dr. Joseph Olskov, along with Cyril Genik, who are considered responsible for the large Ukrainian Canadian population through the promotion of Canada as a destination for immigrants from Western Ukraine in the late 1890s. Ukrainians from central Ukraine, which was ruled by the Russian monarchy, also came to Canada, but in smaller numbers than those from Galicia and Bukovina. Approximately 170,000 Ukrainians from the Austro-Hungarian Empire arrived in Canada from 1891 to 1914. Clifford Sifton, Canada's Minister of the Interior from 1896 to 1905, also encouraged Ukrainians from Austria-Hungary to immigrate to Canada since he wanted new agricultural immigrants to populate Canada's prairies. After retirement, Sifton defended the new Ukrainian and East European immigrants to Canada who were not from the United Kingdom, the United States, Scandinavia, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, by stating, "This Ukrainian immigration to Canada was largely agrarian, and at first Ukrainian Canadians concentrated in distinct block settlements in the parkland belt of the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, while the Canadian prairies are often compared to the steppes of Ukraine. The settlers came largely from Galicia and Bukovina, which are not steppe lands, but semi-wooded areas in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. This is why Ukrainians coming to Canada settled in the wooded Aspen parklands in a arch from Winnipeg and Stewartburn, Manitoba to Edmonton and Leduc, Alberta, rather than the open prairies further south. As well, the semi-feudal nature of land ownership in the Austrian Empire meant that in the Old Country, people had to pay the pan for all the firewood and lumber for building. Upon arriving in Canada, the settlers often demanded wooded land from officials so that they would be able to supply their own needs, even if this meant taking land that was less productive for crops. They also attached deep importance to settling near to family, people from nearby villages or other culturally similar groups, furthering the growth of the block settlements. Fraternal and benevolent organizations established by these settlers include the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, the Brotherhood of Ukrainian Catholics, and the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League. The ULFTA transformed itself into the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians in 1946. The BUC and USRL are part of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress today. By 1914, there were also growing communities of Ukrainian immigrants in eastern Canadian cities, such as Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, and Windsor. Many of them arrived from the provinces of Podylia, Volhynia, Kyiv, and Bessarabia in Russian-ruled Ukraine. In the early years of settlement, Ukrainian immigrants faced considerable amounts of discrimination at the hands of non-Slavic, non-Southern European Canadians, an example of which was the internment. Internment from 1914 to 1920. The political climate of the First World War allowed the Canadian government to classify immigrants with Austro-Hungarian citizenship as aliens of enemy nationality. This classification, authorized by the 1914 War Measures Act, permitted the government to legally compel thousands of Ukrainians in Canada to register with authorities. About 5,000 Ukrainian men, and some women and children, were interned at government camps and work sites. Although many Ukrainians were paroled into jobs for private companies by 1917, the internment continued until June 20, 1920, almost a year after the Treaty of Versailles was signed by Canada on June 28, 1919. There are some 24 Ukrainian-specific plaques and memorials in Canada commemorating Canada's first national internment operations, including several statues on the grounds of the Manitoba Legislative Building and at the locations of the former internment camps in Banff National Park, Alberta, Spirit Lake, Quebec, and Kapuskasing, Ontario. Most were placed by the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association and its supporters. On August 24, 2005, Prime Minister Paul Martin recognized the Ukrainian Canadian internment as a dark chapter in Canadian history, and pledged $2.5 million to fund memorials and educational exhibits, although that funding was never provided. On May 9, 2008, following the 2005 passage of Inky Marks Bill C-331, the Government of Canada, under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, established a $10 million fund following several months of negotiation with the Ukrainian Canadian communities representatives, including the UCCLA, Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Ukrainian Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko, establishing the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund. The Endowment Council of the CFWWIRF uses the interest earned on that amount to fund projects that commemorate the experience of Ukrainians and other Europeans interned between 1914 and 1920. The funds are held in trust by the Shevchenko Foundation. Amongst the commemorative projects funded by the Endowment Council was the unveiling, simultaneously across Canada, of 115 bilingual plaques on August 24, 2014, recalling the 100th anniversary of the first implementation of the War Measures Act. This was known as Project, and organized by the UCCLA, Settlers, Workers and Professionals, Second Wave in 1923. The Canadian government modified the Immigration Act to allow former citizens of the Austrian Empire to once again enter Canada, and Ukrainian immigration started anew. Ukrainians from Western Volhynia, the Wolyn Voivodeship, and southern Bessarabia, also known as the Bujak, joined a new wave of emigrants from Polish-governed Galicia and Romanian-governed Bukovina. Around 70,000 Ukrainians from Poland and Romania arrived in Canada from 1924 to 1939. Although the flow decreased severely after 1930 due to the Great Depression, relatively little farmland remained unclaimed, the majority in the Peace River region of northwestern Alberta, and less than half of this group settled as farmers in the prairie provinces. The majority became workers in the growing industrial centres of southern Ontario and the Montreal region, and the eastern townships of Quebec. The mines, smelters and forests of northern Ontario, and the small heavy industries of urban Western Canada. A few Ukrainian professionals and intellectuals were accepted into Canada at this time. They later became leaders in the Ukrainian Canadian community. The second wave was heavily influenced by the struggle for Ukrainian independence during the Russian Civil War, and established two competing fraternal, benevolent organizations in Canada. The United Hetman Organization in 1934, which supported the idea of a Ukrainian Cossack kingdom led by Pavlovsko-Ropadsky, and the rival Ukrainian National Federation in 1932, which supported the idea of an independent Ukrainian republic, and the armed Ukrainian nationalist insurgency in Polish-occupied Western Ukraine. The UHO ceased to exist by 1960, and the UNF continued to expand and became the largest and most influential Ukrainian organization in Canada, spearheading the creation of the Ukrainian Canadian Committee during World War II. Workers and professionals, third wave since World War II. Most Ukrainians coming to Canada were political refugees and displaced persons who tended to move to cities in southern Ontario and Quebec. There are now large Ukrainian communities in Toronto and Montreal. They established a number of new organizations and affiliated newspapers, women's and youth groups, the most prominent of which was the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine. Political refugees. Fourth wave. Relatively few Ukrainians came to Canada during the Brezhnev and Gorbachev years, as exit visas could take several years to get approved. Post-independent Ukraine. Fifth wave. After the dissolution of the USSR, emigration from Ukraine increased. Rising levels of corruption, the dismantlement of some social services, low-paying employment and loss of jobs in Ukraine made immigration attractive once again. Culture. Having been separated from Ukraine, Ukrainian Canadians have developed their own distinctive Ukrainian culture in Canada. To showcase the unique hybrid culture, Ukrainian Canadians have created institutions that showcase Ukrainian Canadian culture, such as Edmonton's Cheremosh and Shumka troops, among the world's elite Ukrainian dancers, or the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village, where Ukrainian pioneer buildings are displayed along with extensive cultural exhibits. Ukrainian Canadians have also contributed to Canadian culture as a whole. Actress and comedian Lubagoy, singer Gloria Kay, and painter William Kulik, for example, are well known outside the Ukrainian community. Historically, Ukrainian Canadians were among Canada's poorest and least educated minorities, but as the process of cultural integration has accelerated, this is no longer the case, and Ukrainian Canadians are currently near the national economic average. Perhaps one of the most lasting contributions Ukrainian Canadians have made to the wider culture of Canada is the concept of multiculturalism, which was promoted as early as 1964 by Senator Paul Ewick. During and after the debates surrounding the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, Ukrainian leaders, such as linguist Yaroslav Rudnitsky, came out in force against the notion of English-French biculturalism, which they believed denied the contributions other peoples had made to Canada. Partly in response to this, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau shifted Canada to a policy of official multiculturalism. Architecture. The Western Ukrainian agricultural settlers brought with them a style of folk architecture dominated by buildings made of unprocessed logs, which were much better suited to the wooded parkland belt rather than the bald prairie. The first house built, usually a burner, used some sod, but was not exactly a sod hut, more like a dugout. The second house was often a whitewashed and plastered log cabin, usually with thatched roof, very similar to those seen in Ukraine. Barns, chicken coops, granaries, and so on were all built using the same techniques as the houses. By the 1930s, most Ukrainian Canadians adopted the building styles of the North American mainstream, including framed homes and barns built from commercial plants and using milled lumber. Early churches, built by pioneer farmers rather than trained builders, were basically log cabins with a few added decorations. They aspired to the designs of Ukraine's wooden churches, but were much more humble. Latter churches, such as the Prairie Cathedral style of Philippou, using a mixture of Byzantine and Western influences, were much more decorative. Language. In addition to the official English and French languages, many Prairie public schools offer Ukrainian language education for children, including immersion programs. Generally, second-language students are taught the local Canadian Ukrainian dialect, rather than standard Ukrainian. There are a few Ukrainian Catholic elementary schools in the Greater Toronto area, including St. Josephat Catholic Elementary School, Joseph Cardinal Slippage Elementary School, and St. Sophia Catholic Elementary School, as well as Holy Spirit Eastern Rite Elementary School in Hamilton. Politics. Many Ukrainians fled Russia, Poland, Romania, and later the Soviet Union to find freedom and a better life in Canada. For them, Canada became an anti-Russia, where they could realize the political and economic ideas. Most Ukrainian Canadians were anti-Soviet, yet a minor group of Ukrainians has for a long time supported Canadian socialism and contributed to the formation of the Communist Party of Canada, and formed a significant bloc within that group. They were also active in other Marxist organizations like the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. Ukrainians also played a central role in the formation of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the New Democratic Party. Ukrainians were a notable portion of the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion of Canadians who volunteered and fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the leftist Republican government against the nationalist troops of Generalissimo Francisco Franco. The nationalist movement, through the Ukrainian National Federation and the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine, was also an important part of the community. After Ukraine became independent, Canada was one of the first nations to recognize Ukraine. Later, Ukrainian Canadians were vital in fundraising to build the Embassy of Ukraine in Ottawa. As well, Canada has recognized the Holodomor as an act of genocide. Canada also sent many observers to Ukraine during the disputed 2004 presidential election. The government of Canada, as well as its provincial governments, especially the Ukrainian strongholds in Alberta, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, do much to support Ukraine's economic and political development. The Ukrainian Canadians had and have much more influence in Canadian society and policy than any other East European group, therefore they have had several prominent figures in top positions. Ray Natation was the 24th Governor-General of Canada and the first Governor-General of Ukrainian descent. Ukrainians were also elected leaders of Canada's prairie provinces in alternating order. Gary Filmon was Premier of Manitoba nearly simultaneously with Natation, and Roy Romanow was Premier of Saskatchewan, also partly at the same time as Filmon and Natation. Ed Stelmach became Premier of Alberta in 2006 as the third provincial Prime Minister of Ukrainian descent. He succeeded Ralph Klein, who had cabinets with many Ukrainian ministers. Stelmach himself is the grandson of Ukrainian immigrants and speaks fluent Ukrainian. He left office in October 2011. Religion: most Ukrainians who came to Canada from Galicia were Ukrainian Catholic and those from Bukovina were Ukrainian Orthodox. However, people of both churches faced a shortage of priests in Canada. The Ukrainian Catholic clergy came into conflict with the Roman Catholic hierarchy because they were not celibate and wanted a separate governing structure. At the time, the Russian Orthodox Church was the only Orthodox Christian church that operated in North America, because they had arrived first via Alaska, and traditionally Orthodox churches are territorially exclusive. However, Ukrainians in Canada were suspicious of being controlled from Russia, first by the Tsarist government and later by the Soviets. Partially in response to this, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada was created as a wholly Ukrainian-Canadian controlled alternative. As well, the Ukrainian Catholic clergy were eventually given a separate structure from the Roman Church. Arts: Canada is home to some very vibrant Ukrainian dance groups. Some examples of Ukrainian dance ensembles in Canada are Shumka and the Cheremosh Ukrainian Dance Company in Edmonton, the Volyar Ukrainian Dance Ensemble in Winnipeg, the Svitanok Ukrainian Dance Ensemble in Ottawa, and hundreds of other groups. The Ukrainian Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko provides some financial support for Ukrainian Canadian performing, literary and visual arts. Ukrainians in general are noted for their elaborately decorated Easter eggs or pasanki, and that is also true in Canada. The world's largest pasanka is in Vegreville, Alberta. Ukrainian Canadian churches are also famous for their onion domes, which have elaborately painted murals on their interior, and for their iconostasis, or icon walls. Music: Ukrainian Canadian musicians and groups include Randy Bachman, the Canadian band Juris Capella, Ron Kahuta, Rick Danko, Chantal Kreviazuk, Gordy Johnson, and Canadian Idol Season 2 runner-up Teresa Sokiega. The Edmonton-based group Kibasonics focuses on a folk fusion of traditional Ukrainian music with modern touches. Food: cultural food is an important part of Ukrainian culture. Special foods are used at Easter as well as Christmas that are not made at any other time of the year. In fact, on Christmas Eve, a special 12-dish meatless meal is served. The best-known foods are borscht, holodzy, pyrohaya vareniki, and kovbasa. Several items of Ukrainian food and culture have been enshrined with roadside attractions throughout the prairie provinces. These are celebrated in the polka giants of the prairies by the Kubasonics. For example, the world's largest pierogi is in Glendon, Alberta, and the world's biggest kovbasa is in Mundare, Alberta. Institutions. There are a number of Ukrainian Canadian institutions, such as the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, a national umbrella organization established in 1940, represents the Ukrainian Canadian community. The UCC has branches and provincial councils across the country and has dozens of member organizations. The UCC leads and represents the Ukrainian Canadian community to the Government of Canada and to the provincial governments. The Ukrainian National Federation of Canada, the largest Ukrainian Canadian organization founded in Edmonton in 1932 to unite Ukrainian Canadians on a non-sectarian basis for the prime objectives of preserving Ukrainian language and culture in Canada, promoting good citizenship, and supporting the establishment of an independent and democratic Ukrainian state. The UNF is a member of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, an independent group dedicated to the articulation and defense of the Ukrainian Canadian community's interests, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, the main pro-communist cultural association, the Centre for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba, St. Andrew's College, the Seminary of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, and a non-profit university student residence, Ukrainian Culture Summer School, and Youth Hostel, the Ukrainian Museum of Canada, based in Saskatoon with branches in the other major cities of Western Canada and Toronto, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Centre in Winnipeg, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, jointly at the University of Alberta in Edmonton and the University of Toronto, the Kula Folklore Centre at the University of Alberta, the Ukrainian Canadian Archives and AMP Museum of Alberta in Edmonton, the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village, a living history museum approximately 39 kilometers east of Edmonton, the Ukrainian Cultural Centre of Toronto, the Prairie Centre for the Study of Ukrainian Heritage at the University of Saskatchewan, the St. Petro-Mohila Institute, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a non-profit university student residence, Ukrainian Culture Summer School, and Youth Hostel, the Ukrainian Canadian Foundation of Taras Shevchenko, based in Winnipeg, provides some financial support through grants for Ukrainian Canadian performing, literary and visual arts. The Canadian Ukrainian Immigrant Aid Society, a community agency providing settlement assistance for newcomers to Canada. Ukrainian Canadian Social Services, a community agency providing nutritional and financial assistance to Ukrainian Canadian senior citizens. The Taras Shevchenko Museum in Toronto. The Ukrainian Canadian Students' Union, a national organization of students at post-secondary institutions. Distribution. Information in this section taken from 2006 Census Community Profiles. The provinces with the largest Ukrainian populations are Ontario 336,355, Alberta 332,180, British Columbia 197,265, Manitoba 167,175, Saskatchewan 129,265, and Quebec 31,955. In terms of proportion of the total population, the most Ukrainian provinces and territories are Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Yukon, British Columbia, and Ontario. The metropolitan regions with the largest Ukrainian populations are Edmonton 144,620, Toronto 122,510, Winnipeg 110,335, Vancouver 81,725, Calgary 76,240, Saskatoon 38,825, Hamilton 27,080, Montreal 26,150, Regina 25,725, Ottawa-Gatineau 21,520, St. Catharines Niagara 20,990, Thunder Bay 17,620, Victoria 15,020, Kelowna 13,425, Oshawa 12,555, London 10,765, and Kitchener 10,425. The census divisions with the largest percentage of Ukrainians are Manitoba number 12, Alberta number 10, Alberta number 12, Manitoba number 11, Manitoba number 7, Manitoba number 10, Manitoba number 9, Manitoba number 2. It is impossible to know which are proportionately the most Ukrainian municipalities in Canada, since Statistics Canada does not release such information for communities with less than 5,000 people, and Ukrainians are the most concentrated in the smallest communities in the rural West. That being said, the following are communities with a high percentage of Ukrainians: Vegreville, Alberta; St. Paul, Alberta; Street, Ball County, Alberta 26%, Gallery, ...